Thank you for your patience. We would like to begin Bosai Kokutai 2022, Session 19, Climate Change and Disaster Reduction, Thinking about Sustainable City Planning and Communities. I will be the MC for today. My name is Amau. I am from APN, Asia Pacific Network for Global Change Research. Today's program is organized by APN with cooperation from Graduate School of Disaster Resilience and Governance University of Hyogo, with sponsorship from Hyogo Prefecture and Hyogo Environmental Advancement Association. First, we would like to invite the director of APN Center, Ryuji Tomisaka, to say a few words. As introduced, I am Tomisaka, a director of APN Center. Now, I am pleased to offer a few words on the occasion of our participation in the Bosai Kokutai 2022. The theme is climate change and disaster reduction, thinking about sustainable city planning and communication. And I'd like to express our deepest gratitude to the many of you who are interested in and have joined us today to discuss the theme of climate change and disaster reduction, sustainable community development and community. In recent years, climate change is now being called a climate crisis due to the frequent occurrence in various regions of unexpected weather disasters that cause flooding and landslides, such as the torrential rains in July 2008 and typhoons in East Japan in 2019. In June 2020, the Cabinet Office in charge of disaster reduction and the Ministry of the Environment released a joint message, Climate Change and Disaster Reduction, which indicated that the climate change measures and disaster prevention and mitigation measures must be effectively coordinated. Climate change measures include mitigation measures that aim to promote decarbonization and minimize damage caused by disasters. In recovering, it is important not only to restore the region to its original state, but also to take an adaptive recovery approach to adapt to climate change through flexible responses, including land use control. In Hyogo Prefecture, climate change mitigation and adaptation measures have been promoted in an integrated manner in order to minimize the effects of climate change, and APN has been working with the Graduate School of Disaster Mitigation and Recovery Policy of the University of Hyogo since FY 2020. And APN has been holding events for prefectural residents related to climate change and disaster prevention, and participating in classes at the University of Hyogo. Now, we are pleased to announce that the 7th edition of Bosai Kokutai 2022 will be held here at the Hut Kobe, a symbolic project for the recovery from the Great Hanshin Awaji earthquake. The APN, the location institution of Hut Kobe, have been utilizing the resources of the Asia Pacific Network for Global Change Research and the knowledge of the Graduate School of Disaster Resilience and Governance University of Hyogo. And we will be exhibiting at the Kokutai 2022. In order to effectively promote climate change and disaster prevention, this session will feature a panel discussion as an opportunity for participants to consider the need to prepare for the next disaster from the perspective of sustainable urban development and community. The facilitator is Professor Michiko Bamba of the Graduate School of the University of Hyogo, and the panelists are Professor Sharifi Ayub of the Graduate School of Hiroshima University and Mr. Genichiro Tsukada. We will also have a Q&A session at the end of the program to allow participants to ask questions of the speakers, and we look forward to your active participation. This session, with simultaneous interpretation provided in English and Japanese, is held simultaneously online as well as at the venue, and is attended by a wide range of people from within and outside of the prefecture, as well as from Japan and abroad. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for your support and cooperation in organizing this session, and I hope that today's session will be meaningful to you as well. With this, I would like to conclude my opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we have some housekeeping items. First, if you have any questions about the session, we have a time for quick Q&A at the end of the program. People on site, please wait until we bring the microphone to you. Those attending online, please note who you're asking the question to and then post your question. For those attending online, if you have any question about how to use the Zoom features, please use the chat to ask questions and our staff will respond to you. For those attending on site, we have a simultaneous receiver, channel 1 for Japanese, channel 2 for English. Once the session is over, please leave the receiver at your seat. And in order for the sessions in the future, we are asking you to fill up the questionnaire. Please help us by filling up the questionnaire so that we can organize similar sessions in the future. Those attending online, please read the QR code or use the link in the chat. Now, we would like to start climate change and disaster reduction. Thinking about city planning as well as community that's sustainable. Then we have 3 panelists. And before we go into the panel discussion, we are going to have the panelists present about the national trend on the climate adaptation measures, as well as building a sustainable city, as well as sustainable communities, and each of them has a 10-minute presentation. The first presenter is the director from the Climate Change Adaptation Office of Global Environment Bureau, Minister of the Environment, Japan. Mr. Tsukada Genichiro is going to present about the national initiative. And Mr. Tsukada is going to serve as a panelist after this. Now, Mr. Tsukada, the floor is yours. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the introduction. I am from the Ministry of the Environment of Japan. My name is Tsukada. I'm the director of the Climate Change Adaptation Office. Thank you very much for inviting me to this session. So I'm going to talk about the government's approach to climate change adaptation as well as disaster reduction at the national government level. And just a quick introduction of myself. So in 1996, I joined the ministry, but I've been involved in environmental policy for the last 25 years. And some of the highlights, as you see, I was dispatched to the Netherlands in 2010 to learn about the climate change impact and adaptation measures in the water sector in the Netherlands and worldwide. And that experience has been helping me a lot. And from 2014 to 2017, for 2 years and 9 months, I was dispatched to Indonesia as a JICA long-term expert on environmental policy, particularly in the field of solid waste management. And this picture shows me when I was in Indonesia. And after coming back from Indonesia from 2017 to 2019, I was involved in the environmental restoration of Fukushima Prefecture from the nuclear disasters as well as waste management. And after that, I also worked in APN Secretariat in Kobe. And last year, I came back to Tokyo, and then I'm with the current office. But I'm also in charge of the Japan focal point at APN, so I still have a tie to APN as well. So now I want to talk about the national government initiative. These are the climate change impacts in Japan, some of which we are already seeing, and some of them we forecast to happen in the near future. For example, in agricultural crops, rice, grains, has some cases where the quality deteriorates because of the weather. And also it has impact on ecosystems such as on the coral reef whitening and thunderbirds. And natural disasters, Mr. Tomisaka said, we are seeing more and more severe cases of natural disasters. And it also has impact on the health. For example, there is a rising number of heat strokes and the spread of infectious diseases as well. And this slide is about the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the latest scientific knowledge. Well, IPCC is an intergovernmental body established by World Meteorological Organization and United Nations Environment Program. And they have a report every 5 to 6 years, and now they are in the middle of the 6th report. And it's from last year to this year. Some of the reports have been published. Last August, Working Group 1 issued a report, and they concluded that the human activities are the cause of global warming for the first time. And this February, the Working Group 2 published a report, and it said that human-induced climate change has caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people beyond natural climate variability. These IPCC reports, I'm sure Professor Sharifi will elaborate on this, so I will not go into the detail on this. Now, when it comes to the climate change countermeasures, actually there are two main areas. The first is to work on the cause of the climate change. For example, reducing the emission of CO2. And the other side is, even though we work on the reduction, there are some impacts already. And in the future, there will be some impacts still remaining. So we have to avoid or minimum the risk of negative impacts. So that's mitigation and adaptation. And these are the basic two wheels in climate change countermeasures. So from my side, I would like to focus on the adaptation side. So as for the adaptation, actually in Japan, Climate Change Adaptation Act was enacted in 2018. And all the stakeholders are now asked to work together and work on comprehensive measures. On the national government level, there is a National Adaptation Plan, NAP, that's updated every 5 years. And we also did the assessment before that, and then we have the report as well. And as for adaptation, it is very important to be based on the scientific insight. So therefore, National Institute of Environmental Studies is operating as the center of excellence, and there's a legal framework for that. And because adaptation has impact in local areas, so local activities are critical as well. So we formulate local adaptation plans, and we designate local adaptation centers. And this is positioned as an effort that needs to be rendered. And then we also organize regional councils to promote adaptation measures in cooperative manner. And international actions, as well as actions on business, are promoted under this Act of 2018. In the natural disaster sector, these are the major adaptation measures, such as rivers, coastal areas, and mountain areas. And this slide has a summary. I'm not going into detail one by one, but basically this takes the impact of the climate change and then consider that in the major river basins, and also river basin disaster resilience and sustainability by all, meaning that these areas are not managed by the authority only, but all the stakeholders. For example, if there is a heavy rain, you can store some of the water in paddy field, and this is called paddy field dam, one of the initiative example. Or in the city area, they can use the retarding basin improvement. Or if there is a high-risk area, we encourage the move from the high-risk area to low-risk area. So this is part of the river basin disaster resilience and sustainability by all. Using creating hazard maps is also part of the adaptation measures. So as for adaptation, as I mentioned, that initiative at the local level is critical, and this shows the progress. So far, 170 local governments have already developed their plans, and 50 local governments, have already started the centers for adaptations. And 7 regional blocks also has regional councils so that they can collaborate among stakeholders. And I want to give you one example. This is JICA Kansai Regional Council for Climate Change Adaptation. And they have set up subcommittee for torrential rain countermeasures. Torrential rain. Well, I was in Kobe up until last year, but what I can remember was 2008 in Tokagawa, the floods incident, and I was walking in that area as well. But typically people call it torrential rain, but there's a very localized, very heavy rain. The frequency and intensity are increasing, and the damage are becoming more severe. In Kinki region or Kansai region, there is X-rain or extended radar information network for stereoscopic observation of precipitation. And by taking this type of technology as well, all the stakeholders are working together to make an action plan. And Professor Nakakita of Kyoto University is working as a chair, and they're working with the local governments, local branch bureaus and departments, and research institutions, and local adaptation centers too. And another related initiative is in June 2010 under the Minister of Environment Koizumi, and also the Minister for the Disaster Prevention Takeda, and 2 of them made a strategy for the climate change and DRR. As Mr. Tomisaka mentioned in his remarks, and unfortunately I don't have time to go into the detail, but in each area, the measures all include the viewpoint of climate change and DRR. And that was issued as a joint message from 2 ministers. And then you can read this slide later for more details. So the concept of a synergy between climate action and DRR, and I want to give you 2 examples. First is building climate resilient communities using distributed energy. This is Mutsuzawa town in Chiba Prefecture, and they have a Michino Eki or roadside station equipped with the solar energy, and they also use cogeneration as well, and then having the distributed energy system. In 2019, when they were hit by typhoon number 15, there was a widespread power outage in the area, but this Michino Eki and peripheral areas enjoy the benefit of this distributed energy system, and they were able to serve as a central place for the community as well. So this is a good example following this concept. And the other example is the eco-DRR or ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. This is the case of Kushiro Marsh. And by using the water retention function, peak flow would be reduced by about 30%. And this is already scientifically endorsed. So eco-DRR is another example of the concept of synergy between climate action and DRR, and hopefully this will be expanded to the national level. So with this, I would like to finish my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Next, we would like to invite Professor Ayub Sharifi, Professor, Graduate School of Humanities and Social Sciences from Hiroshima University. He will be talking about strategies for building urban resilience, lessons from the IPCC reports. Professor Sharifi will be one of the panelists during the panel discussion session of the program. Professor Sharifi.
For the kind introduction. I would also like to thank the organizers for the invitation. So I am a professor at the Graduate School of Humanities and Social Sciences and also the Graduate School of Advanced Science and Engineering. Today I will be mainly focusing on the latest reports of the IPCC that Tsukada-san also mentioned. So this is the overview. I will start with a brief overview of the losses associated with natural disasters and also give you some brief reports on the key findings of IPCC assessment reports for Working Group 2 on adaptation and Working Group 3 on mitigation. So we already know that there has been an increase in the intensity and also frequency of natural disasters around the world. On this slide, you can see some of these recent natural catastrophic loss events only in the first 6 months of 2022. And they have led to a lot of economic losses and also a lot of fatalities. The trends show that there has been an increase in, again, the number and also the intensity of these disasters, although there might be anomalies, but we are seeing increasing trends. And the other important issue is that these different types of risks are kind of interconnected. On this slide, you can see the most potentially damaging risks and also the risks that they will aggravate. So there are a lot of different risks, and if they happen, they may aggravate other risks such as biodiversity loss and any other risks that would have severe consequences for livelihoods and for quality of life of people. So I would now like to move to the assessment reports of IPCC. This is just a slide to show you the structure of IPCC. There are 3 working groups. Working Group 1, which focuses on the physical science of climate change. Working Group 2 focuses on the adaptation to climate change. And Working Group 3 focusing on the mitigation of climate change. So Tsukada-san already mentioned a lot about adaptation, but mitigation is more focused on reducing the emissions and also enhancing the carbon sequestration, enhancing the sinks. There are also some task force for different inventories, but today I will be mainly focusing on adaptation and mitigation. To start with the key findings of the adaptation report, the report emphasizes that in all cities and urban areas, the risks faced by people and assets from hazards associated with climate change have increased. And also important thing is that the impacts are felt disproportionately by certain groups in the society. So some groups are more vulnerable, and this is very important. The number of people expected to live in urban areas highly exposed to climate change impacts has also increased. There are several examples related to different sectors, but we know that, for instance, for the 1.5 degree scenario, it is estimated that about 350 million people would be at risk by 2050, and for the 2 degree scenario, this will be over 410 million. This is just an example for the coastal areas. It is estimated that by 2050, about 1 billion people around the world would be at the risk of coastal-related hazards. There are also other key findings. For instance, we know that urban adaptation gaps exist in all world regions and for all hazard types. The COVID-19 pandemic has had substantial impacts on urban communities and climate adaptation, and it has also reduced the capacity to deal with climate-related risks because of budgetary issues. The good news is that many more cities have developed adaptation plans, such as those mentioned in Japanese case by Tsukada-san, but only a limited number of these have been implemented, though there is a big gap in that sense. There is also a shift from urban planning to action in ways that identify and advance synergies and co-benefits between adaptation and mitigation, and also for SDGs. Another key issue is that investment in urban adaptation has not kept pace with innovation. This means that still it's mostly focused on gray infrastructure instead of focusing on different portfolio of actions and in an integrated way. The key messages are that city and local governments are key amongst multiple actors facilitating climate change adaptation in cities and settlements. And also the global urbanization offers a time-limited opportunity to work towards widespread and transformational adaptation and climate-resilient development. So we have a limited window of opportunity to tackle these risks. Also, it's important to know that the risks are different depending on the context. So the solutions that we develop, they should be context sensitive because each region has different portfolios of risk, and this requires context sensitive actions. Now moving to mitigation. Mitigation is also important because currently only about 56% of world population lives in cities, but this is expected to reach to close to 70% by 2050. So this means that there will be a lot of increase in CO2 emissions associated with cities. Currently, it's about 70% of global emissions, but this is expected to reach even over 80%. The construction of new and upgrading of existing urban infrastructure through 2050, therefore, is important and has implications for mitigation. There is an urgent need to integrate urban mitigation and adaptation strategies for cities to address climate change and also withstand its effects. And cities can only achieve net zero or near net zero GHG emissions through deep decarbonization. And that means basically reducing consumption, electrification, especially in the transportation sector, and also enhancing sequestration. For sequestration, for instance, we can emphasize on urban green and blue infrastructure that can mitigate climate change through different types of sinks and sequestration. So this is just an example of how effective mitigation could be. There has been a study of 700 cities of at least 750,000 people population. The baseline emission for them is about 14 gigatons, but it is expected that it could reach over 17 gigatons by 2050. But at the same time, if we take actions, mitigation actions across different sectors, including building, transportation, waste, it could reach to, we can reduce this to about 1.8 gigatons. So there is a lot of opportunities, and we can take those opportunities. But these opportunities, the mitigation options could be different depending on cities. The IPCC reports focus on 3 different scenarios for different types of cities. One is emerging cities. These are cities that are expected to experience moderate levels of growth in the coming decades. Rapidly growing cities, which are expected to have rapid population growth and also infrastructure development, both vertically and also horizontally. And established cities which are not expected to experience much growth. These are cities like Tokyo, which has already established, or a city like Kobe. So for the emerging cities, it's important to focus on creating compact, co-located, and walkable urban areas, promote mixed land use and transit-oriented development, and also preserve existing green and blue assets. For rapidly growing cities, actions such as co-locating jobs and housing to achieve compact cities, leapfrogging or transitioning to low-emission technologies, electrifying all urban services, including transportation, cooling, heating, and cooking, etc., and also preserving and managing existing green and blue assets are important. And for established cities, it's important to replace, repurpose, and retrofit building stock, encourage model shift, and also electrify urban energy systems and promote infill and brownfield development. And it's also important to focus on some new technologies, smart technologies, that would allow us to achieve adaptation and mitigation simultaneously. Another important point to be mentioned is that through mitigation and adaptation, we would also be able to provide co-benefits for different types of sustainable development goals. So these are just win-win situations. And also we need to acknowledge that adaptation and mitigation are interlinked, so it is important to take into account the co-benefits, synergies, and also potential trade-offs between them. So just to conclude, I want to emphasize that we need integrated urban system design approaches that would consider both adaptation and mitigation. And achieving transformational changes in cities for climate change mitigation and adaptation will require engaging multiple scales of governance, including governments and non-state actors, and also, of course, in connection with substantial financing that goes beyond sectoral approaches and siloed approaches. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much for the presentation. Now, we would like to invite Professor Michiko Bamba, Graduate School of Disaster Resilience and Government, University of Hyogo.
どのように備えるか。
So now she's going to make a presentation about preparing for increase in meteorological disasters and floods, sustainable city planning in communities. So Professor Bamba, if you can start. Good afternoon. I am Bamba from University of Hyogo. So what I'm going to present now, there are two presenters before me, but maybe my topic will be a little bit closer to what you do or what you know. So today, if you think about the climate change and disaster reduction on the national level or even at the larger, higher level, there are policies. But if you look at the local communities or individual level, what can we do to reduce disaster risks? And I feel like there is or maybe some of you may be feeling that there is a gap between those two. So today, I use the word communities and city planning here, but when it comes to what we can do, maybe it's not really it's not really something that you come up with, and it doesn't mean that I have the perfect answer to that question, but I hope my talk will be a good trigger for you to think about what you can do or what your community can do. So I think the concept of disaster reduction and mitigation has been changing. If you think about the earthquake, this prefecture, Hyogo Prefecture, has a lot of lessons from the major disaster in Hanshin Awaji. And there were other major earthquakes in northeastern part of Japan as well as in Kumamoto. So the experiences have been accumulated, and that led to the improvement of policies and initiatives. However, when it comes to the water damage or the water disaster, we don't really know what we have to do or what we are fighting against. So even though we try to raise awareness, how much we need to raise awareness, so who and how need to take the countermeasures. Still, it's something that we just started thinking, I think. So there's an increase in risk of water-related disasters. But when it comes to financial resources, and if you look at the GNP of Japan, it's slowly declining. So it's maybe not really realistic that we can spend a lot of budget as we did in the past, and then we have to make a bold decision if we were to. And if you think about technical aspect, the management of river and peripherals, or water control, or flood management, or water management. And rather than just depending on the hardware, I think there's only so much we can do, and I think everyone starts to understand the limitations based on. And if you think about the river management, river management, we can't have every possible countermeasures just by having the hardware side. Usually the disaster happens every 150 years or 200 years, and basically we need to prepare for that, and I think that's the level of the infrastructure prepared. But when it comes to the record high amount of rainfall, or the highest amount of rainfall, we hear these words almost every year now. So even though we work on the infrastructure and try to make it more resilient, I think there's limitations, and I think it's not very pragmatic. So we should not depend only on structural improvement. So what needs to be done is disaster reduction and mitigation efforts by various entities, and also implementation of disaster reduction mitigation measures using various means, not just a structural improvement. And also disaster risk-based disaster reduction and mitigation efforts. So if you think about examples of city and community planning which does not depend on structural improvement, one of the examples could be city planning or land use or building regulations in areas where disaster risk is high in accordance with the City Planning Act or Building Standards Act. And recently there was a revision of the City Planning Act, but if you think about Japan, the private right of the landowners are very strong, and it's very difficult to proceed with this. And then we will have a discussion after this, and we would like to work on this. But just the other day, there was a visitor from France, and I learned that there is a major difference in terms of the city planning. But even though the way they plan the cities are good in France, we can't really directly import that from France to Japan, because every country have different requirements, and we need to have different systems and planning for each country. And when it comes to local disaster reduction planning and raising awareness about disaster reduction, I mean, there are many disaster reduction efforts by local governments. And today, I see a lot of people attending today in this event. I mean, not just this room, but the whole event. I can see that there are a lot of people who have very keen interest in this issue. And furthermore, if you look at the local level and local disaster reduction efforts, local disaster reduction planning, evacuation drill, and creation of a mutual help system in case of emergency, so that we can help those who are vulnerable in disasters. There has been progress. Of course, I mean, executing them is not easy, but I think there has been a progress here. And individual disaster reduction efforts are equally important. In the past, for example, in case of earthquakes, I mean, there are many things that we can do on an individual basis. For example, making the house stronger or seismic resistance. But when it comes to the water management, the water disaster, it seems like typically people think that the government can do something about this, and we can't really move away from the idea. But I believe that there are many water disaster reduction efforts that we can do in terms of self-help. And also, if you think about the local areas, the local governments, and national policy, and between those local or national government and individual, we have communities. And for example, we have Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And there are many initiatives are recommended to involve various stakeholders. And I talked about various entities such as national or local governments, local communities, companies, NPOs, schools, families, and individual residents. And river basin disaster resilience and sustainability by all. I'm not going into the detail, but basically, in the past, the national government or the authority of the river management, such as prefecture, were working on the river basin area management. But now it's important to involve others and everyone in the river basin management. Of course, it is not easy to share a very high risk. Now, up to a certain point, the government need to get engaged in reducing the risk, working on the structure. But when it comes to the remaining risks, a variety of entities need to be involved. and they need to work on the reducing risks by working on the river basin. And this type of river basin disaster resilience sustainability by all project, now 109 Class A river systems are involved in this. But there are many other rivers which is out of this project scope. And of course, we can't cover all the rivers, so the local areas need to take some measures. So in order to do that, first we need to identify the risks and what kind of measures need to be taken. So the first step is assessment of the risks so that we can work on the structure and non-structure measures, such as city planning as well as the community level initiatives. So if we consider the flood risk and then I talked about how difficult it is to realize the use and construction. I mean, moving people is one measure, but of course it's difficult because the residents do not want to move because they feel attached to their community. And once they have the water disaster, I mean, their land value go down and it's difficult to sell. And there are some subsidy from the government, but it's very limited when it comes to moving. Therefore, and what about the flood proofing? Actually, it's also difficult. And even though you can afford economically, people have normalcy bias, a conformity bias, and sometimes they feel it's too cumbersome, or they feel it's useless to do the flood proofing of their houses. So if there's a tsunami risk, for example, they have a large embankment, so they are prepared for the next major disaster. But water disaster is usually small scale, and usually you don't end up building a large structural reform, so people tend to rebuild similar houses and they have similar damage in a couple of years, and then this has been happening around Japan. So rather than just making a simple recovery, we also need to consider risk of disaster and to build back better by building disaster resilient house. So when it comes to the reconstruction of individual houses, if you look at the systems in Japan, this building back better concept or building disaster resilient houses, it's very difficult to invest in this or using insurance. Right now, the insurance premium is going up very high. So basically, many risks are left unattended, and that's one concern I have for the future. So this is the flood proofing measures for the housing, and just for your reference. For example, raising the height, raising the floor, or enclosing the house using waterproof fences. Again, all of them cost some money, and people need to think on 10 million yen scale. So it's not very easy to afford these measures. So at least maybe we can make an improvement so that it's easier to facilitate restoration after the disaster. And what about securing an evacuation space even though you cannot fully flood-proof your house? I mean, these are for example, in Mabi town in Kurashiki, they had a lot of single-story homes, and then they can't go upstairs, and then this is one of the measures that they could take. So these, maybe I could touch on this later in the discussion. So basically, the disasters are becoming more severe or severer, and the measures have been taken. However, the local community and the individual, the self-help and mutual help need to be reinforced in face of this type of water disasters. And by working at the local community level, I mean, we can expect to have an impact on individuals as well. And I think that's a very critical aspect. I think this applies to any type of disaster reduction. but basically having local community and individual capability need to be enhanced, not just in earthquake, but also in water disasters as well. And we have to come up with more specific and concrete measures. For example, in case of earthquake, people fixate the furniture and they take seismic proof structure too, but we also have to have something for water disasters so that the general public can understand and take in the measures. Well, thank you for your attention.
ございました。
Thank you very much. So with this, we would like to begin the panel discussion session. Professor Bamba, please take over from here as the facilitator. Thank you. So from here, let us begin the panel discussion session. So based on some brief information provision, we would like to exchange our thoughts. And lastly, we would like to take your questions and comments from the audience so that we can deepen our discussion. So we have very limited time today, but this is how we would like to proceed. So to begin, climate change. So in cities and towns, what did climate change bring about to cities and towns and communities? What are some of the changes that were brought about? Let's begin with Director Tsukada, please. Yes, thank you very much. So there has been impact made by climate change, as I presented, and meteorological disasters. Looking at this year alone, we finished with the rainy season early, but then we have been having very much localized torrential rain, and in Tohoku region, there were some disasters in July, and also a typhoon impacting across Japan. Now, looking at the global situation, in Pakistan there was the Great Flood, so 1/3 of the country went underwater. Europe and China, there's been heat waves. And in Florida, just the other day, there was the hurricane that brought about great damage. So now, how can we say definitively how these events are connected with climate change? But at least there are some impact or relationship between these events and climate change. And looking at Japan, the insurance company has been looking into the insurance payouts. And the top 5 of the 10 have been paid out from 2018. And the number 21 typhoon in 2018 hit the Kansai area, including Kansai International Airport, which calculated the loss of over 1 trillion yen. So under these circumstances, IPCC report was discussed by Professor Shafiri, so I don't want to be redundant here, but through climate change, human system, including urban areas and rural areas, have been impacted. We've been impacted globally. Now, particularly water, including a shortage of water and food. Now, water resources, there have been increase in water shortages due to climate change, but then there's the opposite effect seen in other areas, and this is impacting food supplies as well. And also human health and welfare are also impacted. and impact to infrastructure and resident settlements, we are seeing negative impact in these areas globally. And heat stroke or some infectious diseases that is sensitive to climate change. These are disease infections that is impacting humans and animals through water. And it is said that this trend will increase. And I mentioned about Pakistan's flood. But these great water disasters, when they happen, this is going to generate climate refugees. Now, it may not be technically refugees. It may not be the right word. However, they may be involuntarily forced to move outside of the country or from the rural areas to urban or to the slums. And this mobilization of people could be accelerated according to some reports. And so based on these facts, what we can take measures if we have the resources to do so, but otherwise it would be very difficult to handle. And the same can be said for emerging countries and advanced countries, but maybe I spoke too much. I would like to stop here. Professor Sharifi, please.
Thank you. So I think Mr. Tsukada covered most of the issues. I just want to highlight some additional aspects. There are three different issues that are specific to cities. One is the urban heat island. Another one is the urban precipitation island. And also the other is air pollution, in addition to flooding that we already heard a lot about it. Urban heat island is the phenomena where cities are usually warmer than their hinterland, the areas surrounding them. And climate change, there is a lot of evidence that has intensified this. So due to climate change, we are now having more heat stress events across different parts of the world. And of course, this have major implications for human livability in cities and also for human health. There is a lot of evidence showing that this has led to a lot of hospitalization in different countries around the world. So one particular challenge would be heat island and how to address it. Another is urban precipitation island, which is also in some sense caused by changes in microclimate in cities, meaning that there is a lot of evidence showing again that we have more torrential rains in cities. And this is, of course, also putting a lot of challenges, putting a lot of restraints on urban infrastructure, causing urban flooding, and will have significant implications for cities. For pollution, cities have always been facing with the issue of pollution, but due to climate change and other associated impacts like urban heat islands and etc., this pollution issue has been more intensified, and we also have some phenomena such as smog, where different types of pollutions associated with transportation, with heating, with ventilation, with air conditioning, these are all mixed and causing additional problems to cities. So I think, just to summarize, we have the issue of heat stress, we have the issue of flooding, we have the issue of torrential rains and associated floods, and also pollution. And these are all have been exacerbated by climate change.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. So the problem of climate change, of course, is linked to the increase in natural disaster and such events. But it's not just that. Tsukada-san mentioned this before, and that is that it has to do with infectious diseases and how this is related to health of humans. There is a very close relationship association. So, of course, earthquakes and tsunami, and after that, disasters, and after that, evacuation setup, how that is could impact as well. But the hazards are exacerbated by the meteorological events. And there is various evidence to show the relationship amongst these elements and factors. So with that said, there's various complex, complicated matters. It's not just a single problem. There's multiple factors playing part that is contributing to the exacerbation. So with that, when we think about our society and our cities, what are the problems that are being brought about, and how do we need to address them, please?
じゃあ塚田様の方からお願い。
Well, thank you for that question. As Professor Bamba just described, the climate change is a major issue, but it has and it involves other issues as well. And that's also giving impact on the livelihood as well. For example, if you think about, since the middle of the 20th century, the population started to grow exponentially, and the human activities really changed the state of the earth. And basically, it's threatening the existence of prosperity as well. If you look at Japan, for example, 1960s and 1970s, when Japan was growing rapidly economically, there was a pollution such as Minamata disease, and still there are victims of these pollution as well. And then on the other hand, there was a time of mass production, consumption, and disposal. And that also given negative impact on our life as well. And as a result, some of the resources are depleting, and CO2, greenhouse gases also threatening the ecosystem as a whole. So if you think about the functions of the globe because of the environmental load by the human activities, well, actually, there is a planetary boundary, but once we go over that, it's irreversible, and there will be a catastrophic damage. This planetary boundary concept, when SDGs was, this is the basis for SDG that was stipulated in 2015. This doesn't apply to only climate change, but also applies to the pollution by nitrogen and impact on the biodiversity. We started to see the actual problem around the world, and this is going to get even severer. And today, we talked about the intensification of meteorological disaster, but I think this is one of the examples. Without reducing greenhouse gases, and then we start continue business as usual, then we will go over the tipping point, and there will be an irreversible impact on the meteorological system, and it's difficult to go back. For example, Greenland or South Pole is melting there as well, and the permanent frost is melting, and we are losing some of the coral reef or tropical forest. Once this happens, it's difficult to bring them back to the original state. So in order for the globe or Earth to sustain the state, we have to pursue our life or the quality of life within the planetary boundary. That's what I see. Thank you. So related to that, as an environmental issue, is there any challenge that we need to work on, or any take from Tsukada-san? If you can continue. So environmental issues, I think there are many ways to look at this. But for example, if you think about the theme, meteorological disasters, for example, as you know, we did have meteorological disasters in the past. For example, in the 17th century or 16th century, Takeda Shingen worked on the flood management of the, and then tried to control the flow or build embankment around the river to minimize the impact. So historically, people have been working on this type of measures. So learning from our predecessors, NBS or nature-based solutions is one way to reduce the risk of natural disasters. And I think that's a very important approach. So having this type of approach at the local level, for example, you can use them for the recreation of local people or use it as a tourism assets. And I think that will enhance the level of community, but facilitate the collaboration in case of disaster. So if you think about the disaster, some people say that you have to think about once in a century flood, but because of the climate change, the definition of once in a century also changes. So we also need to take that into consideration as well. And not just adaptation, but the mitigation to climate change is the very basic part of climate change countermeasures. These days, carbon neutrality by 2050 or decarbonization, these words are commonly used in a society today. But this is not something only the power companies or the related industries need to work on. I think each one of us and each local community also need to think about what he or she can do. At the Ministry of the Environment of Japan, we are also calling for the local decarbonization to encourage the local initiatives. And then, basically, the minister selects the advanced area for the decarbonization, and we also provide support. Within Hyogo Prefecture, Himeji, Awaji, and Amagasaki, these three cities are designated as advanced cities, and they have unique initiatives for decarbonization as well. Of course, decarbonization is the critical part, but they also do adaptation, disaster risk reduction, as well as improvement of QOL. And I think the initiative that can solve multiple problems at the same time is important. And just to give you a different perspective, we talked about adaptation and mitigation, but also disaster reduction and SDG. Rather than looking at them individually, I think we need to look at them comprehensively, and then we need to involve everyone concerned and stakeholders to work on them. Well, in the past, some people had an impression that working on the environmental issues may slow down the economy, and there's a disadvantage in terms of the cost. But if you look at the current situation or where we are, our future, we have to think about the economic measures that can create environmental initiatives as well. Well, thank you. It was it's a lot of information. But basically, if you focus on the water disaster, we tend to think or use the word like controlling or managing, implying that doing something artificial by human to minimize the damages. And then that was the traditional disaster reduction. But what you are saying is nature-based approach, by taking advantage of what the nature can do and then conserving at the same time. So in that case, when it comes to conservation, you talked about how important it is for the local community. And then the environment and economy, people tend to think as a trade-off, but you also talked about the concept of planetary boundary. Basically, we have to pursue development within the planetary boundary so that nothing irreversible would happen, and then we can also strike a good balance between the environment and economy, and I think that will lead to the disaster reduction as well. So thank you very much. That was a very rich information. So now I have another question to Professor Sharifi. So if you think about cities or urban areas and society, and if you think about the various damages caused by, or the changes caused by the climate change, what kind of issues the climate change will bring to the cities, and in the future, what kind of things will happen because of the climate change, if you can touch on that.
So I just want to again reiterate that there is a massive challenge ahead of us. And if we go back to the Paris Agreement, that there the countries around the world came to an agreement to have two ambitious targets. One, of course, is 1.5 degree, which is more ambitious, and the other one, the 2-degree target. This means that we commit to reduce global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees above the pre-industrial periods. And these are challenging. Why? Because the remaining carbon budget, in order to achieve those targets, is very limited. The remaining carbon budget is about 1,000 gigaton, and what we are consuming annually is about 42 gigaton. So this means that for the 2-degree target, the carbon budget remaining, which is 1,000 gigaton, would be consumed in about 25 years with the current pattern. So if we continue with the business as usual, we only have 25 years to cross that threshold. And for 1.5 degree, it is more challenging. It is expected that in 7 years, the 1.5 degree would no longer be achievable. So we can see that this is really challenging. And of course, this is one of the planetary boundaries. Climate change is one of the planetary boundaries, and the effects could be irreversible, although there are some technologies, such as negative technologies, to absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. But there are a lot of uncertainties about those technologies, so we cannot rely on them. So speaking of cities, why cities are important? Because when we talk about that 42 gigatons of CO2 emissions being emitted into the atmosphere annually, cities account for over 70% of that. So this means that cities can and should take the lead in reducing emissions. And the more challenging task is that the urbanization rates are, again, still increasing. I think I mentioned in my presentation that the current rate of urbanization is 56%, but it is expected to reach to close to 70% by 2060. And majority of this, close to 100% of this, will occur in developing countries of Asia, including South Asia, Southeast Asia, and also Africa. This means that those countries will experience a lot of new infrastructure development, and majority of the opportunities lie in those countries, because in the past 2 centuries, particularly since the industrialization in Europe, cities around the world have tended to follow unsustainable patterns of development. Instead of focusing on compact cities, for instance, we have focused on suburban development, especially in some regions of the world, such as North America, Australia. And the bad news is that some of these newly rapidly developing countries, they are following the same approach. So they are still following, for instance, the American model of urban development, which requires a lot of infrastructure development. And this is not just for emissions, because when you follow urban sprawl, suburban development, this requires also more land. And it is likely that that land might be located in areas that is prone to disasters, for instance, to flooding. And so it will have implications for mitigation as well as adaptation. So in addition to some solutions such as nature-based solutions, I want to emphasize the importance of compact cities. Compact cities are important if they are, and they can contribute to mitigation as well as adaptation if they are developed in an optimal and ideal and desired way. And by this I mean not just increasing density, but coupling it with some other measures such as mixed-use development, meaning that different types of land uses, for instance, commercial, housing, this could be close to each other in order to reduce the demand for transportation. And also, in addition to this, we need other measures such as improving connectivity or focusing on public transportation. So if we have all these measures combined together, there is a good opportunity to minimize the detrimental impacts of future urbanization, which again could be massive. And of course, we need some paradigm shifts on just focusing on infrastructure development, because this will cause a false sense of security, because we don't know how much severe the future effects of climate change would be, and it could surprise us anytime. So in order to be resilient, we need to also pay attention to the issue of adaptation, meaning to learn from the the past events, and also try to learn how to live with risks, and to learn from those to ensure that we have better coping capacity to future risks. So that's just a summary of issues that we can do. Of course, there are a lot more things that can be done at the city scale.
ありがとうございます。時間もないので、
Thank you very much. In the interest of time, I want to hear more from you, Professor Sharifi, but at least we have very little time today. So you mentioned about urbanization, urban development, and so this, I guess, is about improving efficiency of cities. For example, cities such as Tokyo and Osaka, these are big cities. So the benefits of bigger cities could be disadvantages when we talk about disasters. For example, in case of Tokyo, there's the heat island phenomenon that you mentioned, which is becoming more and more serious. So with COVID-19, we worked remotely from home. But with that over, we probably will be going back into the center of the cities. So you mentioned about compact city, which I guess could be one of the potential solution or one direction for us to go forward with. In case of Japan, I think this could be maybe challenging. So Professor Sharifi, if you could maybe address this point, please.
Thank you. I understand, especially after COVID-19, there have been a lot of concerns about compact cities, because people have this feeling that compactness means more contact, and this could, for instance, increase the risk of the pandemic. But I think when we talk about compactness, again, it's not just increasing density and putting all these different houses close to each other, very packed. But it is possible to, for instance, integrate green infrastructure, including different types of urban greenery, different types of nature-based solutions within compact cities to make them more attractive to people, and also to make sure that in case of some adverse events such as pandemics, people will still have some opportunities to continue with their normal life without putting their health at risk. So I think especially for Japanese cities, in terms of compactness, Japanese cities are not in bad situation, I think. A lot of Japanese cities are already compact, although some forms of sprawl can be still seen in surrounding areas of Tokyo. But if we compare Japanese cities, for instance, to American cities, probably most of Japanese cities are compact. But still, I think there is a lot more to be done in terms of combination of those measures such as land use mix, improved connectivity, improved integration of green infrastructure to further improve the efficiency and also efficacy of compact cities.
Thank you very much. ありがとうございます。やはり
Thank you very much. You mentioned about green infrastructure, which we could pursue more to take them in to the center of the cities so that we can better control the density part. So it's not just concentration or having density, but making the cities compact while at the same time we can take in and design a various functionality. So I think that this is a very new concept in designing or planning cities. So I think that this is something that we should all continue to think together.
Well, I wish I had more time to ask more questions, but for now, we would like to turn to the floor and see if anyone attending today has any questions or any comment to make. So let's see. Do you have any questions or any comments? Please raise your hand. Well, maybe we can give you some more time to come up with the question, but we have some question coming in from remote participants, so maybe we cover this first. So earlier, you talked about the city planning in France is really good, but you can't really directly apply to Japan. And then this is something I talked about. But if you think about the urban planning or city planning, what are the area that Japan is more advanced or behind in terms of urban planning? Well, actually, I went to France to do the field study the other day, and I was surprised because the previous time I visited France was about 5 years before COVID-19 pandemic. So after 5 years, and this year, the city of Paris changed so much, and I was so surprised. So what happened there is that they have less cars and less space for the automobiles, and then we see the lane for bicycles and pedestrians. And I see more and more people on bicycles. And Dr. Sharifi talked about this earlier. But basically, the city changed to more walkable cities where people can enjoy the city by walking around. And if you think about adaptation or city planning, well, it's a city that's easy to walk around, and also the reduction of CO2 emissions. I mean, it seems like there's a policy to achieve this at the same time. And there was a major progress in just 5 years, and I was surprised because Paris has history and they have a big street, but if they wanted to, they can change so dramatically in just a couple of years, and I was really impressed. Well, I think in Japan, we can do that if we really want to do this, but I think it's important to have the policy as soon as possible. So if you talk about the system difference, and maybe I want to start what's good in France. For example, in France, on the national level, they assess the water disaster risk, and that assessment has impact on the urban planning or city planning of local governments. So basically, they can do the zoning depending on the assessed risk. And basically, this is already systemized, and I think that's a very good aspect because they have an integrity in the planning. If you look at Japan and the urban planning, because it's rather segregated, I would say. Well, there is a hazard map, but when it comes to land use or construction, there's no connection, or not. Somehow the connection is lost among them. So I think as a system, the integrity is different from France and Japan. But if you look at, I think what's good about Japan is, for example, if there is an issue or problem, we really work hard to solve the issue with various policies or various institutions and systems. And I think overall Japan worked very hard on this, but rather it's reactive. So when you think about the integrity of the system overall, or consistency of the system, I think there are some shortfall there. And there are many loopholes, that many things not really covered by the current system. So that's my impression. Any questions from the floor or audience on site?
いきます。
はい、静岡市番町市民活動
Well, I'm from Shizuoka City, Bancho Civil Activities Center. My name is Matsuo. Thank you. I listened to your presentation and they were all interesting. As an intermediate supporting organization, and I'm supporting NPOs and volunteers, and all the topic that you discussed so far about nature-based solution, compact city, I'm very interested in those. But if you think about a structure or hardware, government tend to do most of the work. But if you think about, how can regular citizens or NPOs or volunteers do, or how can they get involved, or what can they do? So let's ask Mr. Tsukada. In part of the national initiative, how can citizens get engaged? Well, thank you for the question. Well, I will try to... Well, I don't know if this is a good example or not, but if you think about global warming, and in order to suppress global warming, power companies or industries, they are working on this, but I think it's very difficult for the citizens to get involved. Well, of course, power saving or switching off as often, or try not to use plastic bags. Those are individual activities you can do. And they are important, but those activities alone doesn't really lead to the achievement. So, and then it costs money, of course, and then you have to consider this, for example, but you can put the solar panel at home, or try to use public transportation more, or purchase of electric vehicle, or stop owning vehicles and you only use or rent it when you only need the car. Or the local government, if the local government is working on the local decarbonization, you can contribute to that as well. And also, another thing you could do is basically you can vote for the candidates who's more proactive about these measures on the national election or the local election. I think that's another thing you can do. I'm not sure if I was able to answer your question. Well, if you think about NPOs and volunteers, and what can they do? Well, I think it also, when it comes to the individual or personal activities, and maybe providing information for them so that you can promote these activities. There's a policy on the national level or the local government level, and then we need some interpreter who can deliver that message to the people in the community or citizens. So the bridging is one thing that you could do. But in order to do that, do you feel any challenges that you're facing? Or any difficulty you feel?
そうですね。
Okay, so what I'm thinking is that when we say global warming is a challenge, we need to reduce our emissions and so forth. We all understand these environmental issues that we need to work on. But how do I put this? So city planning, urban development in order to prevent or mitigate water disasters. And I think that there is many of us who are interested in disaster reduction, but we may not be so interested in participating actively to stop or slow down global warming. I think that there is somewhat of a disconnect. So I was just wondering what can be done. Thank you very much. So Tsukada-san mentioned this, and that is about if it's CO2 reduction, then try not driving, use more public transportation, but it may be inconvenient for you. And so how should community provide support? And maybe local governments could provide support to make it more convenient. And also, there's going to be more and more places that will be damaged or by natural disasters. And once you're hit, it's going to take years. And also, it also generates a lot of waste. So it's very challenging in terms of resources. And if you are to rebuild your homes, it's going to cost a lot of money, and it costs a lot of human resources as well. And so building homes is hard. And so mitigating and minimizing disasters altogether, that would be the first important thing. So homes could be resources, but we would demolish them and generate waste. So maybe we can think more about recycling or repurposing, reusing these homes. Outside of Japan, they would recycle these homes to build it back. So minimizing generation of waste is one very important solution or measure to address environmental challenges. So when you're hit with a natural disaster, we should build houses that are more resilient to begin with, and even if they are damaged, make these houses so that they can be rebuilt using the same materials that they were built with. So this is good for the environment, and also it'll be a measure against disaster reduction and mitigation. So I think it's coming up with these ideas. I wonder if there's any more from the floor. So I am Endo from Fukushima. Thank you very much for the valuable talk today. So just one thing. So this is about, I think much of the talk today was environment, so I would like to ask a question about community. So Director Tsukada talked about Fukushima and has worked on recovering the environment in Fukushima. And I do go there often myself, and I have talked with residents, and I hear that you have been and you still are working on risk communication with the local citizens. And so I wonder about any learnings that you were able to take back for future disasters.
Well, thank you for the question. I spent 2 years to work on the environmental recovery of Fukushima. And out of 2 years, I spent about 250 days on the field in Fukushima, in particular villages and towns in Futaba County. And talking to the local governments, I have an experience working with them. because of the nuclear power plant accident and the damage was caused by that accident, so the nature of the disaster is a little bit different from other type of disasters. So there are some uniqueness in terms of difficulties and challenges they face. But in any disaster, basically it's important to go hand in hand with the local residents to work on anything. It's not something that only the government take the initiative, but I think we need to consider the local residents and local people, and I think that's a very, very basic, and I really felt that very deeply as an actual experience. So wherever the disaster site is, I think that's a very basic principle. Thank you. Well, we are approaching the time, so I apologize that I couldn't pick up all the questions, but thank you so much.
Since it is 6 o'clock, we would like to wrap up the session. So we would like to continue with the discussion, really, and I think that we were not able to have very thorough enough discussion. I think that we can continue to discuss and generate more and more ideas, but hopefully this gave us the opportunity to think more about what we can do and how we can contribute. So thank you very much. This concludes the session. Thank you very much. This concludes the session for today. We thank you for your participation. Those of you at the venue, please submit the questionnaire form to our staff members, and please make sure to leave the simultaneous translation receivers at your seat. Those of you joining us remotely, please fill out the questionnaire form through the QR code or through the link sent in the chat box. Please make sure to leave nothing behind. Thank you very much.